Hi guys, last time I should say welcome back to another episode of Togainu no Chi, and last time we went ahead and got out of prison because we agreed to join some death game, even though we could literally just run as soon as we're free, but we're probably going to do it anyway, is what I'm guessing. And now we're with our simp friend, who we just said we may or may not have intercourse with, so let's see what happens. Seated on the bed, his eyes so wide that Akira doubted they could even open any further, Keisuke laid his hands at his side and leaned forward in disbelief.
そんなの卑怯だ。ありえないだろう。トシマなんて。しかも途中でやめられないんだろ。死ねって言ってるようなもんだ。
拒否したところで終身刑だ。大して変わらない。
でも
Grimacing as if it were his life on the line, Keisuke cast his eyes downward.
どうにかならないのかよ。
He let out a low groan and flopped back on the bed. Akira hadn't planned to tell anyone about his mission. There was nobody he considered close enough for that. But now that Keisuke had seen him with his surveillance detail, Akira had opted to give him a short explanation. He and Keisuke had grown up in the same orphanage. They were what you might call childhood friends. What do you mean I might call them? Whatever. Akira hated being tied down, but it wasn't as if being around other people repulsed him. It was just that most people kept their distance, unable to cope with his terse demeanor. But Keisuke wasn't like most people. He was always following Akira around, though he was kind of unreliable. Akira didn't like his honest, some would say naive personality.
もう
Keisuke sprang up all of a sudden, making the bed creak loudly.
なんだよ。
いや、俺がジタバタしてもどうしようもないんだけど。でもなんかいても立ってもいられなくて。
Akira was sitting by the wall and let out a small sigh.
俺の問題だし、俺が決めたことだ。
The light from the room's single lamp wavered, casting deep shadows over Keisuke's profile as he bit his lip and stared into space.
アキラは強いよな。
When I hear you're weak. Still standing in place, he murmured as if he were talking to himself, then exhaled a long, slow breath.
とっととタグ集めて、イルレとやらに勝ってくればいいだけだ。
Those words made Keisuke frown. Akira knew this fight wouldn't be easy, but if there was no other way, then his only option was to get over with it. Keisuke, why was he taking this so hard even though it had nothing to do with him? Whatever happened would be the result of Akira's choices. Nobody else could change his fate. Despite that, seeing Keisuke like this made Akira wonder if he had a heart at all. Supposing their places were switched, would Akira be this worried about Keisuke? The answer was probably no. Lol. Get right, simp. Several hours after he'd slid under his blankets, having finally sent the fretting Keisuke away, he awoke once again to the sound of his door slamming open. This was the second day in a row this had happened. He felt like he could justify being in a bad mood. He rose sluggishly, knitting his eyebrows at the pain in his head. Cold crept up from the soles of his feet. The digital clock atop his refrigerator told him that it was well before dawn. Unsatisfied with having interrupted Akira's sleep, his visitors came trampling through his room without any concern for courtesy.
起きろ。出発だ。
The same black-suited pair as before stood beside his bed, looking down at him. One of them tossed him a small, heavy bag. He opened it. Inside were solid emergency rations, 3 500ml water bottles, and an envelope of money, a sheathed knife, a phone, and a bundle of 5 dog tags, which would serve as proof of his participation in IGRA. Each tag was engraved with a number and a symbol, a 3 and Jack of Hearts, a 6 and 7 of Spades, and a 2 of Clubs. According to the guy named Gwen, he had to take tags from the other participants and form an appropriate poker hand. In other words, the only meaningful tags currently in his possession was the Jack of Hearts. The remaining 4 were all junk. He needed a 10, a king, a queen, and an ace, or if he got another jack, he could go for a full house.
どけよ。
Pushing the cups aside with both hands, Akira began making his preparations. Having two men in stuffed into his already... What? That didn't make sense. Tight room made the process difficult. He stuffed a bare minimum of clothes into the bag's remaining space, then took a bottle of soda water from the fridge and gulped some down to wake himself up. Today, its cool, bubbly passage disagreed with him. As he finished getting ready, he happened to glance at the shelf. A knife in a worn-out leather sheath was lying there. He picked it up, dusted it off, and drew the blade. Light and well balanced, it had a beautiful shape with a decorative engraving. Most of the design had been scratched away, but he could still make out the letters at the blade's base. Probably words in some foreign language. He couldn't remember how long it had been lying there. Vaguely he recalled having received it during his military training, but he had a feeling it wasn't meant for practical use. It was much more durable than it appeared, though, and easier to use than some random knife. He'd kept it all this time because he liked how it looked. Might as well take it. Ease of use was important, and he was accustomed to handling this one. Putting the knife the cops had given him on the shelf, he retrieved the more familiar weapon and stuck it through his belt. His preparations complete, Akira shouldered the big bag and headed outside. He didn't bother to lock the door. There was nothing in that room that mattered. The morning sun was hazy, but still sufficient to make him squint at its brightness.
これから豊島へ向かうためのルートを説明する。
The man began explaining the way, his tone of voice suggesting that he was only repeating what he had been taught. The road from the CFC to Toshima was all but straight, so there was no need to worry about getting lost. However, he would have to pass through several outer sectors of the old lands before reaching his destination. It'd be difficult to make it there alone safely.
案内人を用意してやる。国境で合流しろ。
案内人？
少々雰囲気の変わった男だ。見ればすぐわかる。そいつがいれば旧祖地区も抜けられるはずだ。
If this man could traverse the old lands, he must be quite capable. It all seemed rather suspicious, but with nothing else to go on, Akira reluctantly began walking towards the border. Just walking? How far is it? Even though the CFC had undergone a fair amount of reconstruction, the scenery became increasingly threadbare as he continued towards the suburbs. The gap between the rich and the poor continued, and nowhere was that more readily apparent than the contrast between these deserted houses and the structures built as part of the revival. This country abounded with needless things, while everything important rusted away. He had never set foot in the old lands before, but he couldn't imagine how it could be worse. At last he saw a dilapidated sign indicating that the border lay ahead. He spotted a human figure standing motionless beside it. The man looked at Akira with folded arms. Yeah, this had to be the guy. He's showing an unnecessary amount of skin. This must be the guide. While his clothing didn't especially stand out, he clearly wasn't from the CFC and had a very different air about him. It was the quiet pressure exuded by those who had overcome the harshest trials. A chill ran down Akira's
あ
spine.
んたか。俺を豊島まで案内してくれるのは。
Instead of answering, the man stared at Akira with eyes like a hawk. He couldn't look away. After a moment, the man wordlessly turned his back and began walking towards the old land side of the border. He creeped Akira out, but in the absence of any other options, the only thing to do was follow warily after. He'd heard it would take roughly a day to walk from here to Toshima. Though the way may have been straight, the distance involved was no small matter. If it's straight, why do you even need any guide? The old lands lay ahead. At last, Akira felt his heart beat faster. Ruins as far as the eye could see. There was no other way to describe it. That's how far the old lands had fallen. The sky had still been bright and clear when Akira met up with his guide, but now clouds had begun to gather as though to mourn the wretched spectacle below. The shadows lurking in the wreckage of the forgotten buildings were deep and darker than night. It was no maze, but take one false step and you would lose your way, condemned to wander for all eternity. Many who entered never emerged. There was another reason no one tried to enter the old lands. The refugees were lying in wait. The refugees, the name for the people who, after the war had ended, had found no place for themselves in the CFC or Nichiren. Instead, they had drifted to this blasted place. It was difficult to eke out a living in these ruins. It meant a constant struggle against starvation and death, which was why the refugees attacked anyone who tried to pass through, the same as a pack of starving wolves. If they caught you, it was over. Hungry sighs drifted past in the wind. Voices like a groaning animal, the sound of running feet. And he could see. Wait, all he could see were ruins and shadows? That should be all. Yeah, all he could see were ruins and shadows. He could not distinguish the forms of the refugees. Akira found the atmosphere stifling, but the guide walked on without visible caution. Akira struggled to keep his eyes open. Really fantastic translation we have here. No grammatical mistakes whatsoever. Well, as he was keeping his eyes open on the man, at times he melted into the shadows and seemed to vanish from sight. Suddenly, he heard a strange noise. He stopped and focused on his surroundings. It was a grating sound like that of someone scratching at iron. The kind of sound one might hear emanating from a misshapen work of art. When he took a reflexive step towards it, the guide spun without warning and dashed to his side. What? Do I hear a lion? What was that? It was already too late by the time he wondered what it was. Something rushed out of the shadows from which the sound had come, moving at an incredible speed. The guide grabbed his arm, jerking his body to the side. A sharp, heavy wind shot past his shoulder. Failing to lock onto its prey, the source of the wind planted its hands on the ground, flipping its body as it landed to face him. God. Akira could hear its ragged breath. He could see its glowing eyes in the darkness. Its throat rumbled. Though it seemed bestial, the silhouette on its hands and knees was shaped like a human being. Its presence multiplied. Another and another, like cancer cells dividing. In a matter of seconds, the area was filled with slavering beasts. Slavering. The guide said coolly, clicking his tongue as he came up beside Akira. He had a 15-centimeter army knife in hand. They were surrounded, trapped at the center of a steadily shrinking circle. The air was primed with tension, and they and their enemies watched each other warily. Succumb to the pressure or make one wrong move, and that would be the end.
こんなところで心中はごめんだ。奇遇だな。俺もだ。
Standing back to back with the man, Akira glared at the creatures around them.
数が多すぎる。まともに相手をするな。わかってる。ブラスターのチャンピオンなんだろ、お前。なら楽勝だな。
What are we even fighting? They said they were human, but they looked like animals. Akira replied with silence. Is that what a man sounds like? The growls were growing more ferocious, more insistent. He sensed the guide drop into a crowd. It's just so shocking how what's happening, but how little description we're getting for it. Akira did the same, sharpening his focus, determined not to miss the chance that would come. Eyes peered out from the ink-black shadows, the eyes of a predator is desperate for prey. In an environment such as this, reason was nothing but an impediment to survival. These creatures possessed human forms, but had cast aside their human hearts, and in doing so had obtained strength to rival any beasts. What did they do? Make some contract with a dark god? What are you talking about? If they caught him, he was done for. Shifting his bag higher on his shoulder, he slowly closed his hand around the hilt of the knife stuck through his belt. Behind him, he felt the guide's presence shift. Now. The beast attacked at almost the exact instant that Akira and his guide dove forward. Sharp scraps of metal and glass struck from every direction. He knocked them away, but they kept on coming. He dodged a swarm of grasping arms, slashing at a few in passing. Alright, I guess. He looks kind of haggard. A shriek. Blood sprayed into the air. He saw blood frequently, even in Blaster. The fights had ceased to captivate him, but that instant alone, that first spurt of blood each night, still brought him a sense of elation. Deep beneath the heart, pounding terror of battle, Akira felt something smolder in his chest. The red drops hanging in space burned themselves into his retina. But, as always, it faded, and once that moment passed, he no longer felt a thing, no matter how much blood flowed. The refugees' attacks are chaotic, but once he grew accustomed to them, he found himself able to predict their movements. Can I at least take a look at one of them? Like, we were talking about them, how they've given up their human form, but, like, what am I looking at? Like, what are they? Are they mutants? Are there mutants in the old lands? You can't just not describe or explain things. You can't just bring things up all the time and then not describe or explain them. Like, seriously, this game has been doing that a lot. One of them leapt at his back. Like, I don't know what's going on right now, so it's like, how am I supposed to feel about what's going on, right? I don't really understand what's happening. So there's no tension at all. He tried to shake it off, but it dug its nails in. Pain shot through his shoulder. Another aim for his arm. He swiftly knocked it away with his bag, then slashed at the hand clutching his shoulder. Just before Akira's knife reached its target, a howl of anguish filled his ears, and the weight on his back slid down and vanished. He turned around to see his guide standing there, hard-faced and drenched in back spray. Bag spray? The refugee that had fallen from Akira's back bore a single slash from the base of its neck to its waist. Leaping away from the arms grasping at him, Akira ran after the guide with all his might. A howl followed them, strong enough to reverberate in the pit of his stomach. Everywhere he looked, a labyrinth of ruins. Before him, behind him, to his right, to his left. He had no way of knowing how far it extended. Perhaps the darkness went on forever. Just as he began to lose his breath, the pursuing voices fell away. The guide finally slowed to a more relaxed pace. It had been ages since Akira had to run so hard. He gasped for breath as he looked around. Indeed, he could no longer feel their ravenous presence. Akira shook off his bloody knife and returned it to the sheath at his waist. He and his guard marched in silence for some time. Guess we're not getting any explanation. Let's just move on now. They just gave kids to random parents. Why? It doesn't matter. Okay. What did we just fight? It doesn't matter. It's gone. We're done. Oh, okay, I guess. It's fine. Just a little weird. It felt like walking through a forbidden dimension, one leading to another world. Little by little, as the sun descended, the pale cloudy sky changed to a murky gray. As far as the weather went, it was not the best of omens, but Akira had a feeling that sunny skies wouldn't suit Toshima. Along the way, Akira thought back to the encounter with the refugees. Suddenly he spoke up, narrowing his eyes at the guide ahead. Emma and Gwen had sent him, which meant he had to be on their side, but even so. Akira had been studying the man as they'd cut their way through the refugees. The man had responded with the cool indifference of an exterminator handling a swarm of ants. One could build up the strength and skill, but the ability to maintain one's reason in the heat of battle came only through brutal experience. The old days in Toshima, that certainly made sense. He wasn't really asking because he doubted it. If it were a lie, then Emma and Gwen would have no reason to offer Akira a deal. He simply wanted to hear from someone who had seen Toshima with their own eyes. The guy glanced at Akira over his shoulder, then jerked his chin forward. When Akira followed his line of sight, he could vaguely make out the carcasses of high-rise buildings beneath a sky heavy with low-hanging clouds. Like a mirage, Toshima rose before him. Awesome, it's a dirty city. This is it, Toshima, den of criminals, home of Igra, where fools killed each other for a chance at glory. The taste of death still lingered out of reach. Perhaps Akira would find it here. A slight euphoria washed over him again, similar to when he saw blood. A rusty sign marking the district border came into sight, and the guide stopped without crossing into Toshima. He faced Akira and spread his arms wide, then lowered his head in a theatrical bow. This was as far as he went, it seems. Inwardly amused by the pompous gesture, Akira turned his back and started to walk off. The next instant, the guide seized Akira's arms, pinning them behind him. When he craned his neck to look over his shoulder, he found the guide grinning ear to ear. His stare seemed to grip Akira's heart with physical force. Akira fought to shake him off, but the man's grip was hard as steel. One arm snaked around Akira's head, forcing it sideways. He grimaced as his neck cried out in protest. A low voice filled in his ears. Together with those whispered words, something hot and damp slid into his ear. Goosebumps broke all over his body as the wet sound echoed in his skull. With all of his strength, Akira broke free and spun, throwing an elbow as he did. The guide swiftly leapt back, and then retreated another step towards the old lands, thanks to this sexual harassment. He licked his upper lip, then grinned eerily and performed another ostentatious bow. Hope you like the taste of my earwax. Then he turned, heading for the old lands without looking back. Only after he was out of sight did Akira let out a small sigh and look away. He wiped violently at the ear that the guide had tongued. The repellent sensation still lingered there. At the same time, the guide's final uncanny smile flashed through his mind's eyes. Akira picked at some nearby rubble and released another sigh. Things were looking grim. More than anything else, it was humiliating humiliating, why can't I say that word? To have been caught from behind like that. His mood at rock bottom, he turned to look at Toshima. From a distance, the city had seemed sunken in darkness, and proximity had done nothing to improve that. Everything was hazy and indistinct. The old lands had been plenty ominous too, but Toshima had a different vibe. More venomous, imbued with the stench of vice. Or maybe he only felt that way because of what he'd heard. At last, he stepped over the threshold and set foot inside Toshima. The wide road, which probably continued towards the heart of the city, appeared to contain nothing other than the withered vegetation and a welcome sign for visitors. The sign was a wretched article. Rust showed through where the paint had peeled off, and the bolts fastening it had fallen out, leaving it just enough to hang on. Someone had written atop the sign in spray paint. Akira glanced at the misspelled English words and began walking towards the heart of the city. What did he misspell? Welcome to Mud Haters Carnival. Awesome. I'm excited. Who's Mud Hater? The area near the border had been in severe decline, but here the buildings were tall and clustered like reeds. This place once was one of the most populated cities, but it had become a mere shadow of itself in the years since it had been abandoned. Dilapidated skyscrapers towered like mammoth tombstones, and the moon peeking out from a rift in the clouds bathed everything in pale light. Instead of people, dust and rabble overflowed the streets, though from time to time, manic shouts and laughter echoed across the dark, heavy sky. A foul smell hit Akira's nose. He stopped and looked down at the crumbling asphalt. It was hard to tell in the darkness, but the black stains were visible sporadically throughout. Blood stains. This smell was the reek of death. A nervousness coiled in the pit of his stomach. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. Come to think of it, he scanned the area. Nothing. What he sought was nowhere to be found. Was Igara held in its own special arena? No, even if that were the case, with this many bloodstains, there had to be some. The bodies, where were they? Akira was currently standing at the intersection of two large avenues, but there were no signs of other people around. He could sense nothing more than a lurking presence. Staying alert as per his guide's friendly warning, Akira resumed walking. The buildings watched him pass with silent, empty eyes, like mourners in a funeral procession. Or were they sneering at him? Honey, they're just buildings. Stop. Just calm. You're already losing your sanity, and you just got here. Just as Akira spotted another intersection ahead, he caught a glimpse of movement at the corner of his eye. He stopped and looked in that direction. A ruined store stood at the corner of the block, its large display windows shattered to pieces. Inside he could see a shape moving rhythmically. A person, probably. But there was no telling what kind of person might show up in a place like this. He was about to go on by, but then he realized that he could just make out the sound of feral breathing coming from the store. What was going on in there? The shadow was still rocking to its beats, and the breathing seemed to be growing in intensity. Curiosity prompted him to approach the window. From his place in the shadows, he glanced inside the store. Its dilapidated interior contained rows of empty shelves. Beyond them was a human shape. Unsteady grunts alternated with a noise like something scraping against the floor. The weak moans that occasionally joined the mix sounded a little too nasal to be born of pain. There were two figures, Akira realized, one overlapping the other. The answer finally came to him, but before he could turn and make his retreat, he realized something else as well. Unless his eyes had completely betrayed him, both shapes were... He closed the remaining distance to the window. Their mad dance rose up from the dimness, which was alleviated by the barest sliver of moonlight. Akira's eyes went wide. The figures were both men. The one facing down had his hips thrust high in the air, with the second man boring into him from above. What? The second man arched his back and something flashed dully in the moonlight. It looked like a dog tag. But it wasn't the only reason for Akira's shock. The breaths and moans that Akira had heard were coming from the man pumping his hips, but the one beneath him remained limp and unmoving. Ooh, a little necrophilia! With a streak of red trickling from his ear. Akira turned away. A strange agitation consumed him. The back of his neck burned. Careful not to make a sound, he returned to the street and hurried on his way. We love necrophilia on here, in this channel. Soon he lost all sense of where he was going. His pulse raced. We just got here. Akira, you need to get control of yourself. He couldn't get this spectacle out of his head. Even though he hadn't seen them clearly, the image in his mind's eye was many times more vivid than the real thing. Calm down, he told himself. You don't know if he was really dead. Yeah, but it makes it hotter if he was. Scraping so we can imagine it, right? We can pretend that he was, even if he wasn't. Scraping together what reason he could from the chaotic mess that his thoughts had become, Akira walked up to the remains of a small store on the side of the street. The door was hanging off its hinges. After making sure that he couldn't sense anyone inside, he stepped through the entrance. What does that mean? Making sure you couldn't sense anyone inside. Like, what are you? From the remaining decor, he could tell it had been once some kind of coffee shop, probably quite cozy in the day. He proceeded towards the back, kicking up clouds of dust as he went. There he found a two-person sofa sitting in a corner. He yielded his body to its rusted springs. Taking one of the bottles out of his bag, he poured a great gulp of water down his parched throat. The liquid spread through his belly, washing the worst of his unease away. He exhaled deep and slow, then threw the half-empty bottle into his bag. His heart was still racing. Releasing another breath, he leaned against the backrest. He himself didn't understand what had disturbed him so badly. He'd heard that homosexual behavior had been quite common during the war, given that strict regulations that had governed the soldiers' lives. He figured it had been unavoidable once their sexual needs hit their limits. There were few women on the battlefield. He had also heard that there were almost no women in Toshima. Not only was it overrun by outlaws, it even played host to a murderous game. I like how we're reanalyzing this as Akira just being upset that he saw two men having sex as opposed to a living man having sex with a dead man. Whatever. Found by those starving wolves, a woman would have little to look forward to but torment, used and discarded like some kind of doll. No, what had truly shocked Akira was the fact that the man being Ard might not have been alive. Sure. I don't know anymore, Akira. The act of violating a person who already breathed his last, or else was on the brink of death? That was what had shaken him so. whatever. Like, literally, do whatever you want with my body when I'm dead. You can put anything in any of my holes. Sometimes sex was used not as an expression of love, but rather as a weapon to crush your victim's heart. But if that were your aim, then you would have every reason to keep your victim alive, especially if you were both the same sex. The suggestion, of course, being that it would be humiliating. These games are so bad. I'm sorry. After death, a person was nothing more than an object. Like, how are you supposed to reconcile that? Like, really? Especially if you were both the same sex. Like, how are you supposed to reconcile that? Does every character in these Japanese games have to go through this phase? At least in Western BL's visual novels. They don't have to, I'm not going to say they never go through the phase of I'm straight and homosexuality is disgusting and shameful. But, like, sometimes they'll go through that in Western BLs. Not always. But it seems to be 100% the case in every Japanese BL. It's crazy. It's awful. It's just disgusting. Was what he witnessed simply the expression of an abhorrent fetish, or was defiling a corpse meant to be the ultimate show of triumph? A statement that even in death there was no escape from degradation. It was not inconceivable, but at the same time he couldn't comprehend what would drive someone to such depths. He recalled the flash of metal in the moonlight. The man atop the corpse had been wearing a dog tag. Akira pulled the bundle of 5 tags out of his bag. In this city, tags marked one as a contestant in Igra. Igra, a world ruled by survival of the fittest. If murder wasn't prohibited, was anything? Had that man been aweing his defeated opponent? If so, if one were allowed to do as he pleads with his enemies? No, it was unthinkable. Or it had been before Akira came to this town. His sense of what was ordinary carried no weight here. Perhaps this was his guide. Perhaps this was his guide had been trying to communicate. Really, the translation in this game. The proofreading. Where was it? That disgusting sensation revived in Akira's ear, making him recall this scene from before even more graphically. He clicked his tongue in frustration. This was no time to be getting cold feet. He had come here because there was something he needed to do. No matter how insane this place was, he had no intention of losing to anyone. This incident had served to underline the fact that his experience in Blaster would not serve him here. These fighters were a different breed. If he lost, he might taste a fate worse than death. He would need all the strength and will he possessed simply to survive. As the shock of what he had seen faded, he began to feel a budding anticipation. Somewhere in this ruined city might lie the moment that would set his blood afire, that would sear his brain and body and soul, and as nothing had before. Sighing away the slight euphoria that had risen inside him, Akira slowly extracted himself from the deep sofa. The tip of his foot struck something as he shifted. When he reached out to touch it, he encountered a rounded plastic shape. He scooped it up and dusted it off. The object was an old-fashioned flashlight. The flashlights Akira was familiar with were small enough to fit in the palm of one's hand, so this was probably from before the war. He pushed the power switch and a circle of light illuminated the rundown shop. The battery was still working. But the light would give away his presence, better not use it unless absolutely necessary. He quickly turned it off and chucked it next to his bag. He separated the Jack of Hearts from his bundle of tags, then withdrew the long chain that had been packed alongside them. He threaded it through his chosen tag and tucked the remaining 4 in his breast pocket. Alright guys, I think I will end this episode of Togainu no Chi here. Togainu no Chi. Either way, and next time we might have more discussion of homosexuality from Akira and talking about how it's shameful, degrading, because that's what I love to hear in my BL games, right? Isn't that what everyone likes? Doesn't everyone play BL games so they can hear about how shameful and degrading homosexual sex is? Well, the developers must think that's the case at least, right? Bye, guys.